Happy Thursday to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar, Building the Grid for Growth, Transmission, Load Growth, and Affordability. My name is Sam Overly. I'm the State Policy Manager at the Conservative Energy Network, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. If you have questions during the webinar, please submit them with the Q&A feature, and then we'll reserve time near the end to bring in as many of those questions into the discussion as we can. The power sector is experiencing something few people anticipated just a few years ago. A surge in electricity demand driven by data centers, but also advanced manufacturing, electrification, and other new large loads. While that growth presents a real challenge, it also is a once in a generation opportunity to invest and modernize our electric grid. If we get it right, we can build the transmission infrastructure needed to support economic growth while improving reliability, strengthening resilience, and keeping the electricity affordable for American families and businesses. Of course, seizing that opportunity isn't simple. Projects take years to plan, study, permit, finance, and construct. That raises difficult questions about reliability, affordability, speed to service, and who bears the cost if large loads change course or never materialize. Today's discussion is really timely. In May and June, Grid Strategies released two-volume series examining federal transmission pricing. Volume 1 explains how the current framework developed and how transmission costs move through federal and state regulation. Volume 2 evaluates 12 potential federal approaches for an era of high load growth. Then on June 18th, FERC issued show cause orders to six organized wholesale market regions and their transmission owners. Rather than adopting one national rule, FERC directed each region to examine whether its existing tariff adequately addresses new large load interconnection or to propose changes. Those responses are due in August, so this conversation is taking place while those regions are deciding what comes next. Today, we have four panelists who can look at that question from different parts of the system, and a special thanks to all of you for joining us. Gretchen Kershaw is the Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of Strategy at Grid Strategies. She is the co-author of both the federal transmission pricing reports, and will begin with an overview of the framework and the options the report evaluates, setting the stage for this conversation. Ted Thomas is a former commissioner of the Arkansas Public Service Commission and founder of Energize Strategies. He brings the perspective of a state regulator who has weighed the utility investment, ratepayer protection, and regional market decisions. John Karakalakis is with the Western Way and works in government affairs at West Law Group and Policy. He will help us examine how these questions look in the West, where planning and coordination often occur in a different mix of utility, state, and regional coordination. And Micah Deary, who is the founder of Reality Public Affairs. He brings the public and stakeholder, or the political and stakeholder perspective, how the technical regulatory choices are understood by policymakers and the public, and what needs to be communicated to sustain support for new infrastructure. Gretchen will present first, and then we'll open to the panel discussion. Gretchen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Let me just get my slides up here. And then find everybody else again. So first of all, thank you so much for having me today. As Sam said, my name is Gretchen Kershaw, and I am with the power sector consulting firm Grid Strategies. And I'm going to talk today about our two-volume report on federal transmission pricing and options for ensuring affordability and reliability in the era of high load growth. So jumping right in, I want to start with a quick note about what is happening on the federal and state fronts to respond to increasing rates and surging large loads. So this slide talks about the federal response. In March of this year, the White House signed a ratepayer protection pledge with data center companies in which the companies committed to pay for new power infrastructure needed to meet their demand. And the White House also has a national policy framework for AI it similarly calls on Congress to prevent data center growth from raising household bills. And there are several bills already introduced in Congress, more sort of floating around on this topic, and large load customers themselves are responding, committing in a number of different forums to clearer cost responsibility, infrastructure payments, and paying their own way for energy. On the state side, states with a lot of data centers have been the earliest movers adopting retail level large load tariffs that seek to address the uncertainty around large loads. So, where will they be? When will they come? How big will they be when they materialize? And these retail level tariffs include enforceable commitments on the large load customer side. And I saw there's just been an update. I think there are around 100 tariffs in place now across the country from the states, from the utilities. And you can see here in the blue column, these large load tariffs contain a number of customer protection provisions. So things like long-term commitments and exit charges, minimum billing demands, security and collateral posting requirements, and then some customer-specific facility cost assignment provisions. You may have heard claims that large loads can drive down rates. I just want to quickly touch on this point because it's a really important one. Adding new load doesn't have to raise rates for existing customers, but the impact of new load on rates depends on certain conditions. And so first, system conditions. Is there existing system capacity, or are there major upgrades to the system needed to accommodate this load? It also depends on the timing of the costs and the revenues. So do the infrastructure costs enter the rates before the load comes online and starts paying the rate, or reaches its full expected demand level? And then that third one, it depends on cost allocation and risk mitigation. So are the costs assigned appropriately? Are the stranded cost risks mitigated? So to sort of the TLDR is yes, new load can lower rates by spreading the fixed cost of the electric system across a wider pool, but only if the system can expand in a timely and cost-effective way. This means proactively investing in well-planned transmission and getting rate making right. So that's the sort of essential thing that we set out in this report to talk about is how do we capture the benefits of new load, leverage them to build the grid we need, ensuring they pay for a fair share of the transmission system costs. I have two quick slides to level set for everyone on the call on who regulates what in transmission service and what's the typical framework across the country for cost flowing from investment into retail bills. So on the regulatory divide, the Federal Power Act sets up a framework of cooperative federalism. Jurisdiction is split between the federal and state levels. States regulate the retail sales, so those sales to end-use customers. They regulate allocation of costs among customers and customer classes, generation planning, local distribution, transmission service and intrastate commerce, transmission and generation construction, so the siting and permitting, and other matters that the Federal Power Act doesn't specifically grant to FERC. On the federal side, FERC regulates the rates, terms, and conditions of transmission and interstate commerce, which is essentially all transmission in today's interconnected grid. This includes the rules for planning, cost recovery, and cost allocation to wholesale customers. So that means the load serving entities, the utilities that provide the distribution service. And FERC oversees the transmission owner's return on its investments, so how much it can earn on those investments. FERC also regulates the rates for wholesale electricity sales, so the sales from the generator to those load serving entities that then serve the end use customers like you and me and our homes and businesses. So important point here before I leave this slide is that there is no bright line between federal and state jurisdiction. It's actually a very tangled web, intersecting and overlapping jurisdiction, which makes the questions that we're talking about especially difficult, even though there's a nice chart and there's a nice description in the Federal Power Act. That's not how it is in practice. Quickly, a typical unbundled sale. So this is a sale where the generation, distribution, and transmission are not all bundled together into a single sale. The bundled sales are common outside of RTOs. So in the Southeast and the West, there's a lot of bundled sales where the transmission is part of a larger sale of generation and distribution. For where the transmission service is sold separately at wholesale, this is your regional organized markets predominantly. FERC approves the transmission costs and the allocation of those costs to transmission service customers. These costs are generally allocated on a demand basis, so how much the customer plans to use the system. And then that wholesale customer, the load serving entity, takes the transmission service, pays the FERC-approved transmission charge, and they recover those costs from end-use customers through a state-approved retail rate. So the state approves the retail rate, which includes the already FERC-approved transmission costs. The important point to take away from this here is that there's essentially a two-step process for transmission pricing. FERC will allocate the transmission costs to the wholesale customers. States then incorporate those costs into retail rates. So regardless of how costs are allocated and recovered from customers at the wholesale level, the rates that are charged to retail customers, such as data centers, in most cases is decided by the state regulator. So moving on to our report and how we framed our options, we set out 5 guiding principles that we believe are important for evaluating federal transmission pricing options. You can see them here on the screen. First, ensure opportunity for appropriate cost recovery by the transmission owners. Second, safeguard non-discriminatory open access to the transmission system. Third, promote economic efficiency on the transmission system, or on the electric system in a larger sense. Fourth, promote fairness in line with cost causation and beneficiary pays principles. So that's essentially those who cause the cost and benefit from the transmission should pay for it. And then fifth, be administratively feasible, fast, and transparent. And that last one is important because the perfect theoretical solution may be too difficult to actually implement and therefore is really not a practical option. Now for the options themselves, we evaluated 12 options with a few sub-options as well, and we bucketed them into 4 categories you can see here on the slide. And I will explain the categories. I will briefly describe the options, but I'm not going to go into great detail given our time here, but I'm happy to answer follow-up questions later on any of them. And you should read the full report, and then you can really know all of the details. But I want to note that these options, this is not an exhaustive list of all the options that you could conceive to deal with federal transmission pricing, but we did try to cover at least the categories of options that are in the public discourse today. Many of the options could be combined, and indeed, I suspect that a combination is likely the best, most durable outcome here. First bucket are the timing of funding options. So these options address when the costs are paid, who bears the front end and back end risk of transmission investments. So on the front end, costs may begin to flow into rates before large loads come online and begin contributing to the costs. And on the back end, costs can become stranded or shift to other customers if large loads delay, they downsize, or they leave the system before they fully cover the costs to provide them with service. So you can think of these options as borrowing from state retail large load tariffs, adopting similar customer protection mechanisms at the federal wholesale level. So option 1 focuses on long-term service and financial security commitments, and option 2 focuses on upfront funding for specific transmission costs driven by large loads with reimbursement over time for those costs. Importantly, and why I wanted to cover the sort of 2-step process earlier, these options have to work in tandem with retail rules that are going to pass the commitments made by the wholesale customer, the load serving entity, onto the large loads at the retail level. The second bucket of costs are local transmission cost recovery options. So just to step back for a minute, not all transmission is the same in terms of what drives the need for it, who pays the cost of it, and how the costs are recovered. So one of our aims in organizing options in this way is to draw out that distinction to help with defining the problem that we're talking about and therefore the appropriate solution for the problem. So one of the biggest questions is about local transmission costs. This is transmission that is planned, built, and owned by transmission owners to meet needs triggered by their local planning criteria, so within their service territory. It's commonly triggered by new loads, such as data centers, being added to a transmission owner system. And sometimes these same transmission upgrades are called network upgrades, especially in the generator interconnection context. So the costs of local transmission are typically allocated within the local area or zone, almost always using what is called an embedded cost rate. So that is essentially the total cost of providing transmission service in an area are spread across everyone using the system in that area, the load. And that is regardless of what customer or customers triggered that local transmission need. So our options for local transmission include option 3, which requires transmission owners to charge the higher of 2 possible rates for serving large loads. So that embedded cost rate I mentioned, average cost of the system spread across the area, or what's called the incremental cost. That's essentially the marginal cost of serving that new load, usually based on specific upgrades to the system that have been triggered by that new load. So the theory here is to the extent that some large loads have a materially different impact on local transmission costs than other load, charging them the higher cost-based rate would better align cost responsibility with cost causation. Option 4 would have load serving entities essentially a blend. They would pay both part of the embedded cost rate as well as part of the incremental cost that they trigger. This theory is that where the new large load is triggering a more substantial upgrade, they should shoulder more of those costs. But it's also important to spread the fixed cost of the existing system, the embedded cost, to this new pool of load. So to do so, the service under this option would have the customers paying a combination of those marginal costs as well as the fixed cost of the existing system. And the last option under local transmission is really focused on transparency. This would have transmission providers identify the cost of local transmission driven by a defined set of large loads, so states could take that information and pass the transmission cost on to the end use customers. Third category of options are focused on regional transmission costs. So these are the cost of transmission that is planned through a FERC-approved regional transmission planning process. And the costs are allocated for this bucket of transmission, this regional transmission. The costs are allocated across a broader geographical area, the transmission planning region, commonly an RTO or ISO, but not always, using a FERC-approved regional cost allocation method. So our options here, we have two options that would identify the portion of regional transmission costs that are driven by large loads and either allocate those costs in a targeted way to the load serving entity that serves those large loads, or sort of a lesser option is to provide the information to states. So transparency, identify the cost, give the states the information. The states then can use that in their retail cost allocation decisions. And then we have an option that would focus on widespread use of one common method for regional cost allocation, which is called load ratio share. And essentially what that cost allocation mechanism does is uses load, so the amount of demand in an area, as a proxy for the cost responsibility for cost causation. So we have in our report, I won't go into details, sub options around how to actually determine those load shares and how to use and implement that mechanism. The last regional cost allocation option essentially would allow for large loads to make voluntary payments for regional transmission in exchange for some service benefit like expedited processing, interconnection to the system, or accessing some incremental capacity. And the last option, I promise I'm almost through them, is these are our innovative approaches. So these would more proactively plan for and allocate transmission capacity, giving large load customers more options to directly initiate and fully pay for grid expansions needed to serve them. So options 10 and 11, they are both proactive capacity allocation models. This means that rather than the system we have today where we react to new interconnection requests as they come in, allocate scarce transmission capacity in response, here the transmission provider would actually identify available transmission capacity either in a capacity zone, which is option 10, or they would identify capacity and opportunities to develop new transmission and then allocate through a competitive open season model. That's option 11. And then our last option, option 12, is a consolidated load and generation integration framework. This is modeled in part on Southwest Power Pool's consolidated planning process, where the transmission provider is evaluating large load interconnection needs alongside broader transmission and generation development needs. Promise I'm almost done here, but I did want to give everyone a brief overview of recent action at FERC that is highly relevant to the conversation. Sam mentioned in his introduction a little bit more detail here on the slide. Last October, DOE sent an ANOPR, an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, to FERC focused on large loads interconnecting to the transmission system. And it proposed that FERC establish standardized interconnection process, assignment of network upgrade costs to large loads, readiness requirements, rules for co-locating the load with generation, and new service options for fast interconnection and flexible service. And this docket does remain open and pending at FERC. Last month, FERC, partially in response to the ANOPR, issued 6 orders to show cause one to each jurisdictional RTO ISO, so everybody except for ERCOT, and its member transmission owners. And those orders require the RTO ISO and its TOs to look at their tariffs and explain to FERC whether their tariffs already contain 5 categories of reforms that FERC laid out in the orders. And if their tariffs do not cover those 5 categories of reforms, the RTO ISO and its transmission owners have to propose changes to FERC to effectuate the reforms that FERC listed. And just quickly, the 5 categories are efficient study processes for interconnecting new large loads, cost transparency around large load driven costs, co-location rules, flexible load service options, and rules around studying generation to serve large loads. And responses are due in about a month. Comments from everyone else will be due 30 days later. Just quickly, a couple of conclusions from going through this report. First one is, in some places, the existing mechanisms may already work. So just encourage everyone to think carefully about defining what is the problem before changing the framework to address what that problem is. Second one is that different transmission costs are allocated and recovered different ways. So you may adjust one piece of a transmission pricing and not have the intended result. You have to consider all the pieces together and the different types of transmission. So, for example, if you directly assign more incremental cost to better align with cost causation, you may create disputes over which costs are caused by the particular loads, and you may miss opportunities to have those loads drive down rates for others by contributing to existing system costs. So you have to think about the full picture in designing this. Third, timing matters. That's why I talked about the front end and back end risk. Really important to think about that. Fourth, the federal task does not need to be upending the existing framework, but FERC rules really have to work effectively along state retail mechanisms. Absent some large jurisdictional change from Congress, this is the framework we're in, and we have to work within it. And then the last one, I just encourage leaving room for innovation. Bottom-up proposals from regions, from states, from utilities may offer the most durable solutions and the greatest buy-in. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Gretchen, for setting the stage. I think that's really helpful. And I'll just plug again that the grid strategies reports are really wonderful resources. And so please go read them they're incredible. So you've given us a wonderful federal landscape, but also talking about the state and federal jurisdiction. And I think that's really helpful. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what authority different entities have. I want to begin the panel discussion with the state regulatory perspective. Ted, in the DoD proposal from Secretary Wright, there's the idea of large loads should pay 100% of the network upgrade costs that they trigger. And in the FERC show cause order, talking about greater transparency. As a former state regulator, do these make it easier or harder when you're thinking about designing large load tariffs and protecting existing ratepayers?
I think that depends on geography. It depends on what your role is. In Arkansas, we had the bundled, what Gretchen called the bundled, where they were there together. I think in that context, it makes it easier. When you have split jurisdiction, it makes it harder and it makes it easy to, finger point and to, try to look back at what would have happened when you can't and play the blame game. To me, this policy has everyone's attention. It's how do you do it? I think there's a lot of agreement that we need to do that kind of thing. How you do that is very complex, particularly with the grid, because it's shared by everybody. If a large load upgrades the grid that everybody uses, there'll be time when they're using it. No matter how you try to get them to pay for upgrades, the inverse is also true because they're going to be using the assets that already exist. Because the grid is shared, all of this becomes more complex, and that's a big part of it. Imagine if I had a sister across town and I had a friend whose sister lived in California, and every year we exchanged birthday cards. Well, over the course of a lifetime, there would be a huge subsidy from the ones that were local to the ones that went a long way, but we accept that. There's nobody complaining about it. There's nobody finger pointing about it. At some point with the grid, you have to accept that it's shared access and that it's not going to be perfect. I hope that was responsive to your question.
Yeah, yeah, very helpful. And I think thinking about, the jurisdiction and shared benefit of the grid as a whole, but what do you think of the concept of, cooperative federalism in transmission planning? And what should the federal baseline and the state discretion be? What do you think that looks like as we're moving forward and thinking about investing and modernizing the grid?
To me, there are two kind of key points on opposite ends. One, because it crosses state lines, it really has to be federal. When you're trying to do something regional like the grid, it just can't be all state or you're going to get a patchwork. It's like the interstate highway system. But the other end of that spectrum is if you want ratepayers in a state to pay for it, you got to come through the state commission. You've got to demonstrate value to those ratepayers. And those are kind of the bookends. Of course, there's a whole lot of discretion room to argue in between. I do think you need a federal role because it's interstate. But then if you want to get in the retail ratepayer pocketbook, that has to come through the state regulator.
What do you think are some of the big misconceptions that, the average ratepayer has when thinking about large load and uh, retail rates going up, and they're seeing, large load come on, and they're seeing it as the enemy. What's the big misconception in your mind that you're seeing?
I think some of the energy questions are really a foil for greater societal concern about artificial intelligence, particularly as it will infect the workforce. It's something to grab onto to push back. I also think there's a lack of understanding in detail of how fixed cost economics work, that when you have the same infrastructure and you increase its usage without having to add to that infrastructure, it puts downward pressure on rates for the existing customers. I mean, that's absolutely true. That is a fact. It's a very hard fact to explain because most people don't think in terms of fixed cost and variable cost. They think in terms of one price. The other thing that is always a problem is siting. There is infrastructure fatigue, and this is another tool in toolkit for the NIMBYs and banana folks to say, we don't want it, we don't want it, we don't want it. And it's more of a we don't want it than an AI question or a cost question. It's there against the infrastructure.
Yeah, that's very helpful. John, I want to turn to you and talk a little bit about the West. I think for many people, thinking about transmission planning, the West is a little bit of a black box for people. Much of the federal discussion assumes some of that organized regional markets, and large parts of the West do not have that in the same way. Who brings utilities and states together to plan for, major, new large load in your areas? What does that look like in the West?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And, I mean, as the orders are written for RTOs and in the West, or most of the West isn't one, kind of outside of CAISO and the edge of SPP. But, our utilities plan through regional groups like West Connect and Northern Grid. So, not a single market operator. But, I do think that just because we don't have an RTO doesn't mean there's not coordination. Earlier this month, or end of last month, early July, the Western Governors Association got together and 11 governors of the West signed what they're calling the PACT agreement. It's the Permitting Alignment and Coordination Task Force. And they also endorsed the West Tech 10-year transmission study, which was, states and utilities voluntarily kind of doing exactly what FERC planning assumes. But we just don't have that market operator kind of enforcing it. So, I think you take that, and those are big steps, and really congratulate the governors for doing that. That was a bipartisan move, and I think that's really big news out of the West in terms of transmission planning. But combine that with kind of our Western resource adequacy program and kind of the expanding day ahead markets. I think we're kind of stitching together almost RTO-like coordination, but it's kind of on our own terms. It's not kind of Washington deciding for us. So, I think that's kind of the story is it's coming together on its own.
Yeah, I think that kind of feeds into my next question about what do you think is working well in the West that other regions could learn from or adopt? And then, are there issues that you're saying maybe a larger signal regional structure might be beneficial? Like, where's the give and take there?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you know, certainly there's a difference, and it's not an organized market, so there's no single tariff, no single queue. Planning happens kind of in overlapping state utility agreements. It can be slower to build, um, but I think the costs are kind of more closely tied to who benefits. So. But I guess I would say, yeah, the real risk here is the speed side of it. Data centers and manufacturing are growing, very fast across the West, and patchwork kind of process can mean, can add years of delay. And so, I think that's what PACT and West Tech and what the governors were endorsing is trying to fix is let's cut as many of these delays as we can and kind of look at shared priority lines, kind of common permitting timelines, have a point of contact in each state as kind of the lead. That could kind of speed up this development as much as possible. I think for other regions, and I mean maybe for the Southeast, which is similar and not having an RTO, I guess maybe the lesson is there's a middle path here. You can kind of work on a voluntary kind of state-led coordination and hopefully get most of the benefit and keep moving the ball forward.
So I think a lot of people saw the large data center that was planned in Utah, that I believe is moved on now. Did that have any impact on, kind of regional conversation in the West about transmission planning? Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think similar to what Ted was saying, there was a huge, huge data center development. It was the size of Manhattan. It was going to be in Box Elder County in Utah, and or it's still being going through the process. It's changed its form from how it was introduced, but it still has to get air quality permits and DEQ permits and things. But I think what Ted was saying is, a lot of times people are using energy or the generation and transmission argument against data centers for kind of a proxy on AI and everything. And I think there's a lot of that. And in Utah specifically, the argument that seemed to kind of energize folks was the water argument and saying that this would pull away and hurt the Great Salt Lake. And so it, I think it's just tough because it's on that one in particular. I mean, it moved very fast through the county permitting process, even though it had several years still to go on other permitting processes. And had it been slowed down a little bit and maybe education out there and kind of describe what it does and kind of help, I think that could have changed kind of the perception around it. So I think it's really a story of you've got to do the local work, and you've got to do a lot of education for folks and make sure they understand what it is and what it's not, and really get that local buy-in is just huge.
Yeah, I think that turns to the political and the public perception side of the conversation with Micah. And, we're seeing data centers, electricity demand, rising bills all across the country. Feel like every week I'm reading a new rate case or something is being proposed. And at the same time, the ability to build the grid and serve new industry is becoming, a national economic security and a competitiveness issue. I think that is part of this essential question of can America continue to lead in innovation, particularly in an AI era? I saw a poly market, I think earlier today, that was nearly half of Americans believe that AI is driving up the cost of electricity and water costs. Um, for you, Micah, as you're thinking about like policymakers that want to support the infrastructure needed for the economic growth, they want to compete for this. What kind of arguments do they actually need to, how do they sell this that is going to resonate with voters? And how can they avoid some of these communication mistakes that we're seeing across the spectrum?
Yeah, and Sam, you're hitting the nail on the head in terms of, I wear a number of different hats. Most of my time goes to representing American Power Play, 501(c)(4, and a lot of the work we do is in the transmission space. But honestly, a lot of what we're dealing with too is recognizing what the incentive structure is that policymakers have to deal with. It's very easy for us in the advocacy world and the policy academia world to get lost in that we know how to create utopia, right? Legislators have to deal with political realities and what it takes for them to be able, especially the good ones, to keep coming back term after term after term to keep on moving policy forward that benefits all Americans. And the fact is that we are losing the messaging war when it comes to this. And we can talk all day about what is driving some of those negative narratives, what's causing Americans to believe, in many cases, false narratives around what drives cost, what is causing them to pay more every single month. And the fact is that as much as they may be being fed by false information, Americans, everyday families, may not know what policies are causing them to pay more and feel that pain, but that doesn't make the pain any less legitimate. So we have to be able to take a fundamental step back and understand one, what are the incentives that politicians, that policymakers are dealing with? And also, what is it that the consumers need in order to better understand what is impacting their day-to-day life? Now, there's two different ways that we can go about that. We can both, one, push back on some of that false information, dispel some of those myths, but we can also help drive the narrative of things that benefit them and how it benefits them. And if that's a much more difficult task to undertake than just simply saying yes or no from a policy advocacy perspective. But if we're able to tackle some of those root issues, we're going to get a lot further. And that includes, for example, some missteps, I think, as advocates and also the industry has made early. And that's, for example, when we talk about AI. And first of all, we can't ignore AI. And I think that's an early mistake a lot of advocacy made of trying to ignore the AI conversation, sidestep saying, well, that's not really what we're working on. We're working more on the energy side. We cannot divorce the two issues. Second is that when we're talking about AI, recognizing what is the number one demographic that has opposition to AI, has the most fear about it? It's older Americans that are not yet retired and that are worried, are they going to be able to finish out their careers before they're at a place that, they can't learn a new trade. They're not at a, that takes years to be retooled in the workforce. So needing to work beyond that. Second, though, is who has the most to benefit from AI? And frankly, especially from an economic perspective, from a healthcare development perspective, it's older Americans that will benefit some of the most in the relatively near to midterm. We need to be able to communicate what are the benefits and what does that mean so that while we don't have full control over the pricing and some of the reforms that need to take place both at the state and federal level, it will take years for those to take full effect for people to see in their energy bills. We need to be able to create a leveling effect in the education of the general public, explaining what are the benefits, what is it that you are paying for right now, and what does it lead to? Where are we going to be long term?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your perception or opinion of the risk of either local moratoriums or now we're seeing with New York statewide moratoriums, and I hesitate to say, but I think it's true that I think we'll see more of that going forward. What are the risks, not only for economic development, but also for the opportunity to invest in new generation and grid investment?
Yeah. This isn't the first time that we have seen the moratorium conversation. We've seen the moratorium conversation come in many different forms, not just over the last several years, but over decades and over the past century. It is easy to say no. No is the easiest answer in the world. There's a reason why it's the first word that is used authoritatively by toddlers. No, it's easy. However, what's a lot more complicated is to be able to have foresight, to be able to have foresight to what is the long-term impact, and because that takes more effort, it takes also a stronger effort from advocacy to be able to help caution and to recognize again that fears, just because they may be overblown, doesn't mean they don't have any basis of legitimacy. Helping build policy that is cognizant of that. But when we talk about the general public in particular, I go back to that education piece and helping understand we have been playing from a position of first place in global economic power since the early 1900s. You know, given that we have had a century of that kind of economic dominance, it is really easy to forget what it's like to be playing from second place. And by the way, the most advantageous place to be working from, to be innovating from, is actually second place. It's what we did to Great Britain through the greater portion of the latter half of the 19th century. When you are in second place, you violate trade deals, you rip off other people's technology, and you integrate it more easily because you don't have the ingrained barriers that the first place folks have to deal with. We have all those disadvantages, but what we do have that our global competitors don't have is we do have a culture of innovation that comes from the bottom up and not from top down. The only thing that continues to be a great barrier to that top up kind of solution driving that we enjoy in the United States and in our culture and society is the regulatory environment. And that's why so much when we hear over and over, we hear the permitting conversation come up again and again. Back in the 90s, when I first started getting into the world of advocacy as a conservative, we used the term a lot. We kind of let go of a little bit. I think we should bring it back. Red tape. We got to cut the red tape.
Yeah, I think a lot of this conversation is unlocking the American spirit of innovation. And I think that's carried us through a lot of different challenges over our, 250th our year in history. Gretchen, I want to ask you one question before we turn to kind of a little bit of a cross-panel discussion. Um, you mentioned a little bit of the incremental cost pricing in your discussion. And I saw this morning Ratepayer Protection Act in Congress is being, debated. And that talks about recovering the full incremental costs for any generation, transmission, or distribution that is incurred by these large loads. What are some of the unintended consequences of thinking about this 100% incremental cost? What's the trade-off there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I touched on this a little bit, but it's worth emphasizing for sure that first of all, it's very difficult to figure out exactly what the marginal cost, the incremental cost of serving a new large load is, and it lends itself to a lot of fighting. There are some pieces that are easily determined, a single line that goes to one large load or a generator sitting next to a large load only serving that large load. But when you're part of the interconnected grid, which is what most data centers want, it becomes much more difficult to figure out what that incremental cost is. So that's one of the things. I mean, it's part of the backlog in interconnection queues on the generation side is fighting about what is the incremental cost of interconnecting new generators. So I think that's one of the things we're worried about is it ending up in a world where you can't get any data centers interconnected because of all the fighting about that incremental cost. And whether you support data centers or not, I think they're a reality. I also really want to emphasize that, and it's a point that Ted made, we have a lot of fixed costs on our grid, and we have an opportunity to leverage new loads to spread those fixed costs out. And so we want load growth in general is a good thing for the system. And so I think that too much focus on allocating incremental costs to large loads without considering the impact on the rest of the system will do a real disservice to ratepayers writ large. That said, I do think that there needs to be a marrying of decision makers. And that's why I say I think that there's a blend of options from the options we put out. Totally agree with Micah on bottom up and innovation. I do think that the states in an area need to align with the RTOs. They need to come up with what is the compromise that gets large loads paying their fair share of the system costs, but also leveraging them to benefit the rest of the system users. And when the AI race and economic development and all of the other benefits that come with this new loads in our society.
Thanks, Gretchen.
One
Before we,
additional thing,
yeah, go ahead.
if I could add real quick, one additional challenge here is you want certainty of costs for investors, but there's a 40-year asset, so the system changes. It's blending those two concepts is very difficult also.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Um, Before we transition to the Q&A section, and please throw in questions that you have, um, I want to ask the whole panel, maybe quick round robin of, if you could implement one reform over the next 5 years to improve affordability and reliability, in the face of large load growth, what would it be and why?
Me, it would be a requirement on the generation side to align the contract length of the large load with the rate recovery path for those assets. That way, they're paying their fair share in generation. It's easier to me to segment that out. If they want a longer contract that costs less per year, they need a longer contractual commitment. If they want a shorter commitment, they can pay for all of those assets in a shorter period of time. Then if they leave the system, all of those assets can become system assets. And to me, when we look at this, it's risk. How do we protect them from the risk? How do we protect them from the risk? We also need to think, how do we get consumers participating in the reward? And if your contract lasts 15 years and it's a 40-year asset, you have 25 years of useful life that goes to the system if they leave. For me, you got to align the contract path on the generation with the rate recovery path.
I will say, I'm with Micah on cutting the red tape. I would have Congress pass a comprehensive permitting reform package with strong transmission provisions. I think that we needed to build our grid before data centers came. We still need to build our grid, and the highest cost, least reliable, highest emissions option for serving data centers is them all going off the grid. So we need to get infrastructure built, and I think that we really need Congress to step in there.
I'd agree. Permitting reform for transmission, full stop.
I want to add a little more context on that because I'm agreeing with both Gretchen and John here. We need the federal government to act. The federal government is probably the most significant barrier on the permitting front. However, if the federal government acts and state governments do nothing, we still are leaving an awful lot on the table. I'm a federalist at the end of the day. I think that states should be exercising the tool of collaborative federalism that is given to us through interstate compacts. Bring greater alignment to the state permitting processes. Do it collaboratively. I would encourage largely looking along RTO lines, although there's some significant states that are split within RTO, so that's not a perfect footprint solution. However, it should serve as an initial guide. And listen, I don't think anyone who knows me well thinks it's a secret. I'm a big fan of Governor Cox in Utah, and he says it's just because we go to the same barber. But no, truly, I'm a fan because Utah's leading the way on things, including interstate compacts with their neighbors and bringing greater shared division and alignment even to the regulatory process. Interstate compacts are my number one bet.
A lot of great ideas. I'm on board with the permitting reform personally, but um, we've got a number of questions in the Q&A section, so we'll do our best to cover them. I want to start, we got two questions here that kind of play hand in hand. Um, about how we ensure that we're planning for future growth without overbuilding that infrastructure and what the coordination with economic development efforts look like so that we can ensure that there is the transmission needed when the industry arrives.
To me, the grid can play the special role that this is grid superpower because we're looking at all kinds of infrastructure. If you overbuild your generation, your risk can be covered by a robust grid to sell power where they don't need it. But you need a big footprint to do that. To go from New Orleans to Minneapolis because it's all in the market it's one transmission rate. If you try to go from, let me use a Mobile, Alabama to Charleston, South, well, that's not the best example because Southern is so much of that. But if you pancake the transmission rate to get distance, then it costs too much. The grid, even if you overbuild the grid, it's a smaller component of the charges than these other things. If you overbuild generation, you're going to rip the face of ratepayers off. If you have a robust grid, you're reducing the risk of supply demand imbalances because the supply and demand can be linked together because you have a robust grid.
And if I can tag in here, I would actually also say, in addition, that the greatest thing that can lead to overbuilding is trying to add in government incentives because the market will follow incentives. And when you do that, the problem is government is also the least responsive. It takes forever for a correction out of regulation and especially out of Congress. However, even then, there's still a silver lining. And I think there's a great story that's coming about innovation and markets, even coming into overly structured markets. In Australia, of all places, Australia followed the incentive structure of building renewables. They overbuilt, and the result is in the past year, over 7 terawatts of stranded electricity because of the overbuilding in places that there wasn't even enough grid to get it anywhere else. But what's happening now is micro data centers are being built all over Australia in these remote places because that's where the electricity is available. And so it's emerged a whole new market that is something that government never would have conceived in the first place. Markets saw the opportunity and built into it. So even if we were to overbuild, and I would say we shouldn't be too concerned about it, if we'd overbuild, we're going to consume the energy. Energy is economic power, and I would be too. Um,
Yeah, I was going to say I would love to see anywhere that the transmission system has been overbuilt or new transmission has not immediately been fully subscribed. It's the risk is extremely low, and I think this is where I go back to my point that there's different types of transmission. So if you're talking about a transmission that facility that really does only serve a data center or a particular end user, that's very different from the regionally planned, cost-effective backbone grid that will never be overbuilt. I don't think that's possible. The other thing that I'll note is that FERC's Order 1920 specifically provides for this type of planning to account for uncertainty. So planners are supposed to be using multiple scenarios of the future. So they look at what are the policies on the ground, what are the generators seeking to interconnect, what's the load seeking to interconnect, and then they plan out the system under different scenarios, and they can pick from those different scenarios essentially the least regret system, the system that's not going to be overbuilt, if you will. And then they update those over time. And so there is sort of these mechanisms built in to account for uncertainty. So we really, I think on the transmission side, especially, there's a really low risk of getting to that concern.
We've got a number of questions here about how when data centers and large load are actually reducing costs for ratepayers. Can we maybe, provide a little bit more clarity on that and spreading fixed costs over more kilowatts, what that actually looks like, maybe in a broad economic terms?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at least when I'm talking about the spreading the fixed costs, I'm really focused on the transmission system, although it certainly applies on generation as well. And I think that's where you need there to be not significant transmission system upgrades required by these large loads. So they are using the same existing system, but with more users. That's your ideal scenario for economically reducing the rates for everyone on that system. When the more that you have significant upgrades needed just for that particular load, that's when it starts to be more challenging. But then it also just depends on how the rate is designed. Are those new loads sharing in those existing system costs? That's sort of the big picture for me. There's different like system conditions that have to be present for that downward pressure on rates to occur.
Think about Priceline in the context of airplanes and motel rooms. If you're a motel and you have one room that's unoccupied, you still have to pay the same mortgage. There's all these costs that you still have to pay whether it's occupied or not. And that's why you get on Priceline and you get these deals. because they're going down to the fixed cost level or the variable cost level. That's all they have to beat to be ahead. Same for an airline. If you got a full plane, if you have to add another one more person, well, then you need a whole plane, a whole pilot, and all that stuff. If you can fill to capacity, it relates to capacity. So if you have a grid asset that's 80% 80% used, and you can bump that up higher, you don't change the fixed cost of the grid asset and you get more money. So the per unit cost of everybody that uses it goes down. And in the utility world, we share that way. In the motel business, if there's a spare room, you pay for your room and you don't worry about it. So there's a little more sharing in the utility world.
We've also got a question here
Yeah,
about,
I was just going to add one quick other note, which is just that at least on the transmission side, there have been these significant points of congestion, right? Not enough transmission in different areas of our country for a long time. And it's always a hard question of who pays for them and when is the right time to make the investment to address these needs. And so I think that sometimes when people are thinking about the rates going up, you have to sort of think about what was already needed and where were rates going to go up anyway? I mean, most of our system is 60 years old. I mean, we have aging assets. We have increasingly severe weather events. So we have all these needs that existed before large loads. And so rates were going up for other reasons. And so it's a very difficult and it's actually very state specific because there are different policies and different decisions that have been made in different markets in different states and different areas of the country that will result in rates in one place going up because of X and another place rates going up because of Y, another place rates may be going down. And so it's really hard to generalize about the rate impact given all those different factors.
yeah, I think that's helpful. And to the question about what's the right rate making framework for balancing the load growth and affordability and the least cost planning, I think it's going to depend a lot on the area and the different circumstances, that there's probably not one right answer for such a wide variety geography as the US. We also have a question, I think probably time for one more question, and it's this question about what role should private investment play in financing new transmission infrastructure versus where does public policy step in to help finance, or maybe that's just cutting back some of the regulatory, burden that makes it hard to build.
To me, the magic word system is all the private investment. Public power plays a very important role. But when you have private investors stepping forward, and they're typically seen as granny stocks, safe stocks, retirement stocks, when they're putting all of that investment forward, and then you have it managed according to how things are managed in the private sector rather than the public, there's efficiency that is gained.
Yeah, and I'll just say for large scale transmission at the regional, interregional level, public investment, public financing, public grants, various funding tools can be really helpful, especially in the highest risk early stages of development. And a lot of that is because of our broken permitting system and how long it takes to develop these lines. Private capital often doesn't want to step in because there's just this very long timeline with very low certainty. And so some of the programs that Department of Energy is running, they step in early and provide that sort of bridge, that first step, that stamp of approval from the government, and then private capital will step in and take it on from there. And even with the traditional investor-owned utilities, sometimes they struggle with large-scale transmission lines because they have to put it into their rates or they carry this really large capital investment on their balance sheets, which can raise rates for customers before the line is operational. So it becomes very complex, but there are these specific points at which public financing at the state and federal level can be really powerful to move something along. And ultimately, the same project will cost less for ratepayers because of that specific targeted role of the public financing.
Well, we've come to the top of the hour. I think we filled that whole hour with a wonderful discussion. I want to give a special thank you to Gretchen, Ted, John, and Micah for helping us work through all these questions. I think it was very valuable. And thank you to everyone who joined us. We will be sharing the recording of today's webinar with everyone who registered. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon.